NAFI would like to thank Sporties and AOPA for their generous sponsorship of this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast. Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the More Right Rudder podcast from the National Association of Flight Instructors. My name is Sarah Staudt. I'm the Program Development Manager here at NAFI. Joining me today is John Booz. John is a DPE, NAFI Master Flight and Ground Instructor, Fast Team Rep. He's presented at NAFI Summit, and he's an aircraft owner. Welcome, John.
Hi, glad to be here.
Yeah, thanks for joining us. And so today we are talking about the benefits of both scenario training and using AI, kind of the latest and greatest tool out there for instructors to help create these scenarios and kind of some of the pros and cons and, tips to actually use it well.
Great. Yeah, excited to talk about that. As an examiner, I see a lot of people have really mastered rote level understanding of things, or rote level recall of information, but they're not able to apply it or go into making decisions based on it. And this is where scenarios can really help.
Yeah, because that's where they are forced to bring it all together. I certainly was that student pilot with goodness only knows how many flashcards made out of note cards and
Sure.
for everything under the sun.
Sure.
But
For example, I might have an applicant. I'm asking the applicant about a cross country flight. A private pilot check ride always includes a cross country flight planning, and the applicant is supposed to describe the flight. And I'll say, well, is it okay? What are the risks? What have you looked at? And I say, well, I've done NW craft. Well, NW craft is good and it's useful and it's a great thing to learn, but it's not the end. It doesn't dive into it's a stepping point to then dive into looking at decisions. So that's where, and just being able to make decisions and being able to evaluate situations is something that we need to build in our students as flight instructors.
right, yeah. So we definitely don't want that applicant's first experience walking through a cross country scenario and digging into all of that be the practical test.
Exactly,
But
exactly.
part part of getting them ready for that is building out and understanding those instructors building out and understanding those scenarios as instructors. And that is difficult. CFI training includes some of that. But again, a lot of CFI training, focuses, on your needs and your levels of learning and all that. And there's not necessarily a huge emphasis on how to build effective scenarios, especially when you're getting into like larger, more complex things like a cross country flight. And so,
I
we
agree.
need to talk about what are some ideas and tips and tools and ways and incorporating AI into that to get those flight instructors building better scenarios for those students before they get to the practical test.
Sure. It's a great point. Picture yourself in a lecture style ground school, and I know that that's not what everybody's doing, but if a person were in a lecture style, we might learn about airspace using the airspace triangle or something like that, and that can be very effective to learn it. But then to be able to apply it, we need to do something. And there's an old saying that experience is the best teacher, and we make mistakes. We learn by making mistakes, but we don't want to make those mistakes in aviation. So scenarios can be kind of a simulator, if you will, for making decisions. You can put a person in a situation and get them to think about it, and then as an instructor, that's then your opportunity to guide the student through it. So I think, Sarah, what you mentioned, that the guidance on how to create them and use them could be improved, and so we start there with what we have, and I think the key there is to start with what is it when we're thinking about a scenario. We want to think about what do we want to accomplish? Why are we doing a scenario? So that we could pick anything. If I take the cross country example, one of the risk management things in the elements in the ACS is to not only evaluate the go no go decision, but the continue and divert decision. A lot of applicants will focus on the go no go decision. They'll get a weather briefing and they'll look at it and say, yeah, the weather looks okay, or I've looked at the METARs across the whole route, and now it's okay to go. And if we look at the weather of today or the actual check ride day, the weather might be pretty good. So we have to then look and see, well, what happens if it's not as good? How's that going to affect the go no go decision? But then if we look at what's happening en route, then that affects the continue or divert decision. That's just kind of an example. So the scenario, it's like any lesson, right? Whenever we set out to teach something, we want to start out with what is the objective? What are we trying to accomplish? Why are we even sitting here? Why are you and I talking here? The objective is we're trying to talk about developing scenarios, and AI is a tool that can help with that.
Mhm.
We can
Right, and you wouldn't wanna go to
so a
AI and
scenario
say I was gonna say, you wouldn't wanna go to AI and just, any of these chat bots online and just say, "Hey, tell me what my student pilot needs to know." You as the instructor still have a bit of legwork to go through the ACS first and kinda pick out those elements and say, "Hey, I wanna build something that really hammers home these couple of points," because you also don't want these scenarios to be so huge and overwhelming that your learner can't really or struggles to get the message. You want to target in on, a couple of events. Maybe it's
that's a
something that's
great point.
particularly relevant to your area or the learner's weak points, something like that.
That's a great point. I like to think of scenarios as a collection of either big scenarios that has a whole big thing, here's weather and here's everything else, and little scenarios. We can say, hey, we're flying along and such happens. It's kind of a let's pretend sort of a thing. So those are mini
Mhm.
scenarios, and we can put those in various places through the training to help develop that aeronautical decision making. Because aeronautical decision
Sure.
making, we can learn the rote parts of it, but being able to actually do it is something else.
Right. And of course, the complexity and depth of these scenarios will grow as your learner advances and gets closer to that practical test. So you may
Sure.
start off with some of those mini, 1, 2, 3 question ones. And then, yeah, you are going to have to get to that point where it is weather decision making, that whole thing. For a scenario I used to use for flight reviews near where I live, as I live on the East Coast, you can hop to the beach in about a 2-hour flight, less than that. But if you go in a straight line from here to the beach, there's a Class Bravo airspace, there's a stretch over open water, there's 2 restricted
Oh,
areas, so you're not going in a straight line to the beach, and then you gotta decide where are you doing, over the water, you're gonna go through the Class Bravo corridor, because there is a great one that's popular to use, but then there's a stretch of open water where you're down pretty low, and so, growing those scenarios in complexity as you get closer is also a key part.
that's great. That's a great example. And you can actually take that scenario, that big scenario, and you can think of little pieces of that scenario. So depending upon where the student goes, yes, I'm going to go all the way around the Bravo, or I'm going to take the corridor through. Depending upon what they do, you as the instructor can anticipate what's the next hazard, what's the hazard that I want the student to see, and then ask them about that, introduce them about that. What about the water? What are you going to do about the water? Uh, Flying over water,
Mhm.
that kind of thing. So how do we mitigate those risks? So that's kind of sprinkling little scenarios into the larger overarching scenario. But I think if we back up a minute, if I say, okay, the a scenario, what is a scenario? It's a situation. It's a situation that we can put a pilot into, and it starts with we start with the objective. What are we trying to accomplish? I don't know, system malfunctions in the airplane, weather that's changing en route, the adverse winds are taking longer to get there. So maybe we have fuel. We have to think about what is the objective we're trying to get the student to think about. Then we can, I'm calling that the end point or the objective. That's the end point. Then we identify a trigger. So what is the thing we want to do? Let's say we want them to recognize adverse winds, and we want them to recognize the need to divert for fuel. Many students, they're always flying with full tanks, and fuel doesn't really come in as a where they're going to land with 4 hours of fuel reserve, so they don't really think about it a lot. So how do we fix that? Well, we artificially tell them you've loaded up the plane up with all your friends, and now you only have your 30 minutes of legal reserve. Plus, you've got to get them to guide them to see that they want more than that. So 60 minutes of reserve. So then we think of what's the trigger event? Well, the wind now is something that's there. So we need them to recognize we need them to see how do they see that the wind has changed, and then once we have those elements, we can build a story around it. In your example, right? Why are we going to the beach? Is it just to goof off, or do we have an important event there? Is there some other reason? We can start to think about other external factors we want to roll in. So we take
Mhm.
those four things. Right? What's the objective? uh, Objective. What are we trying to learn? What's the end point? A trigger event is huge, and then build a story. For a system failure, a trigger event could be, I don't know, the low voltage light comes on, or the oil pressure suddenly reads high or low, right? That's the trigger. So then we can build it around that. So any thoughts on that, Sarah?
No, I like that because the biggest thing I'm thinking is you may even want to have 2 or 3 trigger events, because what if they miss that first one? What if they don't notice that those winds have
Oh,
picked up? There's gonna have to
yes,
be
that's a
some
good
sort
one.
of secondary catch. Maybe that low fuel light comes on, or maybe
Yes,
they're on an IFR flight plan and they need to update their arrival time, or their, something like that, like a secondary, kind of like a catch, because of course you don't I don't know how impactful it is to let them miss the one and then just keep chugging along like everything's great. You'd of course want to give them a period of time to catch the trigger. But I personally would build in, a secondary or a third one. I guess that low fuel light, or hey, maybe
that's
the
great.
passengers. I noticed these, or something like that. Because
Yeah.
even you don't need to have a particularly well trained passenger to notice the fuel needles point down.
That's great. I think that's a wonderful thing. And as a flight instructor, as flight instructors, we have more experience than our student does. So we can
Mm.
see and we can anticipate what future problems could happen. And like you said, not just a single thing or whatever, a noise or the wind. We can see, okay, then what's the next problem and what's the next problem that's going to happen, and we can keep compounding it to get them to get them to analyze it.
Right, and that secondary trigger wouldn't even necessarily need to be related to the first one. So the
Right.
winds are drawing down your fuel, but that second trigger might be, okay, well, now the weather at your destination has gotten worse, and now you've got to divert, but okay, now your divert option,
Right.
kind of bubble is smaller because you have less fuel than you thought you were going to. So that it doesn't necessarily need to be a linear, it's all about, just this one system, or just the weather, or just the airspace, or something like that. Your triggers uh, can be of a variety.
And this is where I want to start talking about AI just a little bit, because AI can help with this. Now,
Mhm.
AI can help with any of those phases, right? What is the objective we want to do? What are some triggers that could cause it? And it can finally help build a story. Now, we don't want to hand everything over to AI and just say, just give it all to me. I mean, you can, but you're not probably not going to be real happy with the results from it. But you can use AI to, let's say we want to start with an endpoint. We could pick something from the ACS, for example, like, oh, there's a task in the ACS about evaluating. I just talked about the one evaluating the risk of making the go, no go, and continue divert decision. And a lot of applicants have focused on the go, no go decision, but they don't really have a methodical way to think about the divert decision, continue divert, while you're already en route. Um, and so obviously we need something that's a longer flight, not a 10-minute flight. We're thinking about a 2 3 hour flight for that. And at some point we can think, now we might have come up with a blank on what are some reasons to make that continued divert decision. Well, we can ask AI for that. And it can come up with suggestions for us, which is sometimes can
Mhm.
get us past that sort of writer's block of figuring out what we want to do. It can be a great tool, but
Yeah,
we do
absolutely.
have
I
to be
I
careful
use
with
it.
it.
I'll admit I use ChatGPT to help come up with, just YouTube video descriptions, the show notes. The my recording software here has an AI built in that'll write
Sure.
my show notes and all that kind of stuff. And so it's great. It's not perfect. I do as much as I can try to run as past an editor, like a real live person editor. But yeah,
Sure.
it does get me moved, like, oh, okay, yeah, that does sound a lot more engaging, or that, and I pretty much never use it as it generates, but it does probably 90% of the work that I would struggle with for a while to make it sound better.
Well, that's good. And one of the things to be careful about, well, a couple things to be careful about with AI is if we're trying to use it to look up, um, definitive or regulatory things, it's not really AI's strong point. I mean, the term is AI, artificial intelligence. It's not really intelligent as much as it is. I guess the term that the software people like to use is it's a large language model. It looks at a lot of information that's out there, tries to correlate what you're asking with that information and give you some responses. So it can give you responses and it can be very confident sometimes and it can be wrong. So it can tell you
Mhm.
if you ask it a question, it can just be wrong. And it's kind of, it almost gets, well, I've asked it for things like I thought, "Hey, this would be a nice thing." As an examiner, I have to ask applicants every single thing that they got wrong in the knowledge test. Now, I thought, well, this would be handy. I'll take those ACS codes, feed it into AI, and it'll pop out a list of the plain text version of it. And it did, but it was all wrong. It was like 80% wrong. And then, of
Oh,
course, I would
wow.
asked it, "Why is this wrong?" And it got kind of defensive, almost like a 5-year-old saying, "Oh well, let me try again. I'll try harder." And then, anyway, it's a long story, but I found it just wasn't very good at coming up with information like that. Does that mean it's not useful? No, it's useful, but you have to use your own knowledge and everything that goes around it. It can, and it might also use sources that aren't really FAA quality. Or as a flight instructor, we
Mhm.
have to base all of our information off of what's the word the FAA talks about. Not reliable sources, but the correct sources. So that'd be FAA documents,
Mhm.
manufacturer things, not just what somebody writes about their opinion about how to do something or another. So the AI doesn't necessarily apply the correct weighting to that. So we have to be careful about that. But once
Yeah,
we
I've
have it,
definitely had better luck with it in kind of like the creative side than the technical side of that. Now, if it'll come up with a link or something for me and I can go verify it, that's nice, but I would definitely
that's a
use it more for the creative
great
side
feature.
um
That's a
yeah,
great
just
feature.
wholesale
That's
believe
a
that,
great
oh,
feature.
okay, like you said, it said this test code is this.
Yeah, that's
Mhm.
actually a great capability. And I don't want to go off on too far on a tangent, but I asked it. I was trying to find what's the regulatory reason basis for having a compass deviation card, and I was looking and looking and looking. I had a hard time finding it. So I asked ChatGPT, and it pops up with it pointed it took a couple of tries, but it pointed me to the actual reg. Then I was able to read the reg and see, okay, here's the regulatory basis for that. So
Right.
it's interesting. You can use it to point to things, but you don't want to use it as like the authority, even though it will answer and it appears to like position itself as an authority.
Yeah, so but it is. It's not, and I have seen it get, that defensive almost as well, and it's like, "You're not even real. You're you're a
Right,
computer."
right. So I had a couple of ideas for moving forward with scenarios, and something that a person can do. You could take, so like the ACS, and start with ACS and look at it's every single task in the ACS has a risk management item. Applicants should identify, assess, and mitigate the risks. And for example, for ground reference maneuvers, you have to mitigate those risks. What are landing areas? This kinds of thing. What if we have an engine failure? All those risks. Cross country. What about what happens if this happens or that? Or so you could look at those ACS tasks, and those might trigger ideas in your own mind. But you can also use AI to help create a scenario out of that. The key is in the prompt. What is the question you're asking AI? So I used ChatGPT. I asked it, I said, create a flight training scenario to explore the risks on a cross country trip for the continue or divert decision based on hazardous weather. So kind of a long mouthful, but I copied and pasted items from the ACS into that, made it into a thing, and it came back actually with a 2-page scenario. It says here's a flight training scenario, and it's actually pretty detailed. It has a departure destination. It's got weather, visual cues, current weather. Talks about some deteriorating weather, and some of the things it wants you to look at. I'm not real crazy about, but it's food for thought. It's some stuff that a person might have already been thinking of, but there might be other things there that are useful, right? That you could use to build on and create something new. Kind of use as a rough draft for making a scenario. This would be an example where I was talking about a larger scenario.
Mhm. But yeah, like you said, it got you 90% of the way there. It gave you some new ideas. Yeah, you had some bits you didn't love, but that's your discretion as the instructor.
Right.
And say, like, that's not what I'm going for. That doesn't, maybe apply to our scenario. Say maybe it gave you, a departure and destination that's, um, not within the geographic area you were targeting for this. Maybe you're trying to get some sort of specific anomaly or something going on. But that's great. So and 2 pages, that's a lot. That's a lot. That
It
would give
is.
you
There's
plenty
a
to work
lot, but
through
but
with it.
it breaks it down. It breaks it down into here's the I mean, it's how it formats it is actually kind of helpful. What's the what to do in weather risk, performance, scenario variations. It gives some other ideas. So
Oh.
it's you could think of it as a jumping off point to then create your own story that you use. And then once you have the story, you can then use that with a student and deploy it and start putting in the what ifs. What if this happens or that happens? How would you know if there's a thunderstorm along the route? Get them to think about what are the in-flight weather resources. AI can help point you in the right direction. But it's not you wouldn't necessarily want to just take this, print it out, and then just start using it with your student. You have to put your thinking cap on and make sure that this makes sense and this is what you want to do with it.
And also, like you mentioned, how it can just fabricate stuff. So did it start with your prompt and you really wanted to focus on those couple of ACS elements or so, those decision making elements for that particular learner? Did it take that and run and get too far off the point? And so now
Yeah,
this scenario, or maybe not the whole scenario, isn't as valuable to you because you wanted, to more focus on something else. And it kind of, I've definitely seen AI do this, just hang a left and then
right, right.
you end up with something that looks great, but it's not what you were going for.
Yeah, you're talking about creating a rabbit hole that you can run down into over another spot.
Mhm.
It's not necessarily bad, but you have to filter those things out, and again focus on what is your objective with this. What is your objective as the instructor? If you want your student to understand what are the limitations of onboard available onboard weather or in-flight weather resources. We want them to know, well, what do we want them? They could learn, okay, ADS-B in radar has a delay, maybe it's 10 minutes, and they can remember that. But being able to apply it in a situation, that's where the scenario comes in. That's when you'd say, okay, there's a thunderstorm. There are thunderstorms at the destination, but you're going to get there before them. Now you've launched, so how will it? What if those thunderstorms change? The weather forecast you have now is different than the actual weather is going to be 3 hours from now when you get to your destination. So differences between launch and
Mhm.
en route. It's AI can be really helpful to help you come up with suggestions on where to go with these trigger points.
Mhm. And one other thing you brought up that AI can be a valuable resource for is generating graphics and images to help teach certain concepts or topics.
Yes, I've used it. I've made a few graphics with it, and it's surprisingly good. And it's much better graphics than I could do by, say, if I drew something. I asked it to come up with to look at night landing and thinking about landing light. Is a landing light always good? Is it always necessary? Are there times when having a landing light can actually increase risk? I wanted people to think about that. So I asked it to come up with some ideas. It generated a scenario, and then then the Chat GPT said, "Would you like me to create a graphic?" And it created a kind of a cool graphic of a 172 flying over a dark runway, and it's this little like narrow spotlight beam coming down to the runway. And some of the things I would probably change on it, or like the text, but I could go back and ask it to do that. I thought it was pretty slick that it could create something that looks actually pretty professional from a
Hmm.
yeah, that would be it's better than what I could do, and I thought that was pretty neat.
Yeah, and it does it near instantly too. It only takes a matter of seconds. But like you hinted at, you might need to feed it the prompt or feed it refinements to get it where you want to be. And sometimes it will, it'll misunderstand your refinement and it'll change something else that you didn't want to change. And so it's still a fantastic tool. But again, just like we were mentioning with AI in general, it has its limitations and it doesn't always understand what you want, and so you as the instructor still have to be picky with everything it generates, even if it's a refinement of something you were going after to make sure it didn't change something else.
Right, right, right. In the end, you're the one delivering the training. You're the one that's. It gets back to what is your objective in delivering the lesson. What is it you want the student to learn? So you don't want these things to get in the way of that by adding too much complexity or too much or emphasizing the wrong things or even having or worse yet having wrong information in them.
Mhm.
So it's a useful tool. And one of the things that's for sure is that AI is going to continue to improve. It's really improved pretty dramatically over the last couple of years. And it's going to continue to evolve. And I think we need to well, keeping up with it maybe is one way to phrase it. It's a tool that's useful to us, so we can take advantage of the improvements in AI to help us do our job and help our students cultivate that, especially the aeronautical decision making.
Yeah, and just like we've seen the evolution of EFBs. When they first came out, they were pretty basic. They were pretty much replicating what you could do with a plotter and an E6B. And now, we're what 15 years or so into EFBs, and my goodness, what they can do is just spectacular. So,
Right.
especially with like those flight tracking and debriefing tools and color coding, all sorts of things and the information that they can bring together in one picture. So AI has the potential, that technology, to kind of be on that same path where, yeah, right now it's still a great tool, but it's only going to get you 90% of the way there. You absolutely still need to get your hands on it, refine it, make sure it's right, use those correct resources, but keep using it because it'll keep learning. And in the future, there's always going to be an element of you as the instructor are the authority and you've got to make sure it's right, but it may become more reliable. It may be able to create more subtle scenarios or things like that. It has the whole world available to it as far as what kind of improvements we may see in the coming 5, 10 plus years with this.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, it's definitely a tool, and you know, well, what's the old saying for if the only tool you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail or something like that. It's not a tool. It's not a tool that's going to work in every single circumstance, but it's useful, and
Right.
particularly for these things. We just
Hmm.
have to keep an eye on what its limitations are and what it can do, and then it can be very useful and helpful for us to help our students.
Especially for newer instructors who may not have a lot of operational experience coming into it. Certainly when I started as a flight instructor, I was at 300 something hour flight instructor maybe. And I just didn't, all my experience had basically been my flight training. And now, as we were talking through this, you're talking like, oh, the divert decision. I'm like, oh yeah, I remember that time I diverted because the weather went down to 200 and a half at my destination, but it was like rural nowhere, Montana. So I didn't have IFR divert fuel and all of that. So I diverted
Right.
early. And I'm like, but I would not have had that experience to build a scenario like that as a new flight instructor. I've been a CFI for almost 20 years now, so as your flight instruction experience grows, you can maybe use AI to help expand on scenarios you have. But for those new instructors, this could be a really great tool because you just simply haven't had the opportunity to experience, those types of things yet. Or if, it's been a limited opportunity. Maybe you've had it happen, but it's not the same as having an extra 20 years under your belt.
Sure, sure. Yeah, really, what risk management comes down to is what are the things that could go wrong with this flight? And I know the FAA focuses on NAFI resources focus on like what disastrous thing could happen as a result on this flight. But we could expand that to think about what is any undesirable outcome that's a risk.
Mhm.
It's not life or death if I miss the wedding or the graduation or something on a cross country flight, but it's important, right? So those are important, and I want to avoid that. So AI can help us see some of those things, like you say, fill in the gaps or expand our knowledge base to consider
Mhm.
other options that we haven't really thought of.
Right, and I'm also thinking, you said where it generated the scenario you made, it generated a departure at an arrival airport. Well, that could be anywhere, and that might
Right,
be a way. A lot of flight instructors are in this boat. You kind of spend a lot of time in a single geographic area. Maybe you
right.
relocate to somewhere else, but I kind of joke I'm having a big day if I get more than 30 miles from my airport. And so, uh, it was what if it generated something, 3 states away and the terrain is different and the weather variables are very different? That's a great learning opportunity for both of you.
I agree. I agree. And you see that in well, I see that with applicants where they'll say, "Oh, my private pilot applicant, I have a personal minimum of a 2,500-foot runway." And I say, "Well, that sounds great." And that's because they've trained here, trained in an area where they're living at whatever 700 feet MSL. So I said, "Well, okay, what if we were in Wyoming, right? We're flying out of Laramie,
Mhm.
Wyoming, and it's a 7,000 foot. What kind of runway length do you want there?" And they've never even thought about that. So it's a case you're building a case for scenarios, using scenarios. That's a scenario you could put somebody there. It doesn't have to be a huge long scenario like, why are we in Wyoming, that kind of thing. You could flesh it out with more things. But it comes down to what's the objective? What are we trying to accomplish with the lesson? And want if we want applicants or want students to look at applying their rote knowledge or being able to correlate it to other things, we need to think creatively. How would they correlate whatever this takeoff landing distance table to and personal minimums to something else, the effective density altitude, for example. And then once we've
Mhm.
had that objective, then we can think what the trigger is. Okay, we're going to go to Laramie, Wyoming, for example, and then now we can build a story around it. And so that's how that's it gets back to the original part, which is talking about scenarios. It's want to start with what's the objective, and then figure out what's the trigger event, and wrap a situation around it. And the other thing for us, a good scenario, there should be a mission. There's a reason to go and some consequences for not going. Uh, we can use scenarios to help develop decision making with our students. They can go from memorizing things at a rote level, which is very useful because that rote memory can be recalled very quickly. But we need to apply that rote memory to situations, and
Mhm.
we almost need to simulate a situation, and that's what a scenario is. So we start with what's the objective, what do we want them to learn, figure the trigger event, what is it that's going to trigger that thing that we want them to evaluate. The rest of a scenario needs to be a mission, so there's a reason why we're flying, we're taking this flight, a consequence for not going. So it's not as simple as, well, I was going to go here, but it doesn't really matter. I'll go there instead. It doesn't take too long to think of some reasons for going and consequences for not achieving it. And you can think about ramping that up. It's a family event. You have to get home for work the next day. You're returning home, or your spouse has to get home to work the next day. And oh, by the way, you've canceled the last three flights because of this, and your spouse has been late for work, and your spouse doesn't want to fly with you again if you cancel a third time or a fourth time. You can start thinking about how those things can escalate because we want to add that. I'm talking about for external factors here. Anyway,
Mhm.
we put those together, learning objective, a trigger, situation, and then we can deploy it and guide them through the decisions.
Right, and that's the big part there is, yeah, this is a fantastic tool for building it, but it does not replace the flight instructor's guidance through actually
Right.
getting through those decisions and wrapping in, other decision-making factors. It'll give you that prompt or trigger, And then you'll need to help fill in any gaps. And who knows, your applicant might think of something you didn't. And they'll come up with something and then you've got to work through that idea too.
That's true.
So, real intelligence might play a role here too.
Actual actual intelligence. But that's a good thing
Yeah.
because that means they're thinking of it. They might come up with a creative solution, and that's wonderful. That's what you want them to do. You want them to start correlating these things together. What's the likelihood that we're going to start developing fog at the destination, or what's the likelihood that this thunderstorm might move faster than predicted? That sort of thing. So yeah, the
Mhm.
student can come up with something new, and then that's fine. You can either just stop and deploy something else that takes them in the direction that you want them to see.
Yeah. So a lot of opportunities with scenarios and using AI to augment their development and bringing more real world applications and scenarios into our training in the earlier and kind of all throughout those training phases. So that way these applicants are used to working through scenarios and then go on and see their actual operations as, with these scenarios where they're used to working through this broader array of topics right from the start.
Sure. I think that's great.
Great. All right. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, John. We really appreciate your insights, both as a longtime instructor and as a DPE to help flight instructors develop these scenarios better and keep us informed on the latest tools out there.
Happy to be here. Thanks so much for asking me to join here, Sarah.
Yeah, we're happy to. Thanks again, John.